Her name was Claire Donovan, though few called her that during her years in uniform. To her unit, she was Donnie, a name that rolled easily in the dust of desert bases and clung to the fabric of her fatigues. But before all of that, before the boots and the barracks, she was simply Claire, a quiet girl from the coastal town of Lewiston, raised on the rhythm of waves against piers and the hushed prayers of her grandmother's kitchen. She grew up with hands that loved to build, to fix, whether it was her father's worn-out fishing nets or the tiny engines of rusting bicycles. There was a steadiness about her even then, something unshaken in the way she faced the small storms of youth. When she enlisted in the Navy at 19, she told her mother it was not escape she was after, but belonging. "I need to be part of something larger than me," she had whispered on their porch, as twilight painted the harbor gold. Her mother had nodded, a hand brushing her daughter's cheek as though memorizing its shape. The world was unsteady, and Claire wanted to stand where the ground still felt purposeful. The uniform became that ground. The early months of service were a blur of cadence and commands, of boots striking pavement in perfect synchrony. The sound was not harsh to her. It was music, an assurance that she was no longer alone. She carried herself with quiet determination, rarely boasting, but always studying those around her. On nights when exhaustion blurred the edges of the barracks, Claire was the one who reminded her bunkmate to drink water, who left notes of encouragement folded into lockers. Even then, there was a quiet strength behind her smile, a warmth that belied the hardness of the life she had chosen. But service, like the ocean she grew up beside, was both beautiful and unforgiving. The deployments came quickly, first to the Mediterranean, then farther east. Claire remembered the salt of the sea air clinging to her lips as the ship cut across restless waters. She remembered the laughter of her shipmates, their voices carried by wind over steel decks. She remembered the nights when the horizon seemed endless, stars burning fiercely above as if refusing to be swallowed by the dark. And she remembered the silences, the moments when fear moved quietly through the corridors, unspoken but shared. The sudden alarms, the coded voices over the intercom, the times when the ship grew too still, as if waiting to exhale. Those were the moments Claire learned how deeply courage is rooted not in the absence of fear, but in the insistence to move through it. One evening, as the sun set into a wash of crimson and gold, she found herself leaning against the cool railing, watching the sky fracture into brilliance. A fellow sailor, Ramirez, stood beside her. He had a way of speaking softly, as though words might shatter the fragile beauty of twilight. "Funny, isn't it?" he murmured. "We're out here in the middle of nowhere, and somehow it feels like the center of everything." Claire had only nodded, her hands gripping the metal, eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt the truth of his words reverberate within her. Out there, on the open water, she was both infinitesimal and infinite. It was during one such deployment that her resilience was truly tested. A storm had risen suddenly, fierce and unrelenting, battering the ship with waves that roared like ancient beasts. The decks were slick, voices shouted against the howling wind, and the night was carved apart by lightning. Claire remembered the sting of rain against her skin, the ache in her arms as she worked alongside her crewmates to secure what could have been lost. She remembered the tremor of fear in her chest, but also the strange calm that grew stronger with every command obeyed, every task completed. The storm raged, but within it, she found herself more certain than ever of who she was. Later, when calm returned and the sea lay quiet once more, she sat alone in the mess hall, hands trembling faintly around a mug of cooling coffee. Her reflection wavered in the dark surface, and for a moment she saw both the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. She let the memory wash over her, not with regret, but with a kind of awe. Service shaped her in ways she could never have anticipated. It taught her the cost of silence, the weight of trust, the fragile beauty of camaraderie. It taught her that sometimes strength looks like standing tall against chaos, and sometimes it looks like kneeling beside a friend, steadying their breath. And though she would carry scars, some visible, some not, Claire began to understand that they were not marks of defeat, but of survival. Each one was a story written on her body, a testament to what she had endured and who she had become. Years later, when she would sit on her porch once again, this time no longer 19 but a woman shaped by service, she would recall these beginnings. The smell of sea salt, the sound of boots in cadence, the laughter of shipmates, the fury of storms. All of it part of a mosaic that was uniquely hers. And beneath it all, she carried the same quiet conviction she had when she first left home, that to serve was not simply to give, but to belong. That to wear the uniform was to shoulder both burden and honor. And that, no matter where the tides of life carried her, the sea and the service would always remain in her blood. The years after deployment carved themselves into Claire's life with a quiet, relentless persistence. The sea had once been her constant companion, its rhythms, its tempests, its vast horizons, but now the land stretched before her, steady and unchanging. The uniform that had given her belonging now hung in her closet, the fabric faintly scented with salt and metal. Civilians passed her in grocery store aisles with eyes that did not know her name, and for the first time in years, she felt adrift. At first, Claire told herself she would adjust quickly. She moved into a modest apartment overlooking a row of trees that swayed gently with the wind. She found a job at a mechanic's workshop, where her hands could still find solace in fixing what was broken. Yet the quiet of evenings pressed against her chest in ways she hadn't anticipated. The silence was not the same as the calm she once cherished on deck. It was heavier, lonelier, almost suffocating. She would sit on the edge of her bed at night, the room lit only by the amber glow of a street lamp filtering through blinds, and listen for sounds that no longer came. The bark of orders, the rumble of engines, the laughter of shipmates echoing down corridors. Instead, she heard only the hum of her refrigerator and the hollow tick of the clock. Her hands trembled sometimes without warning. Memories surfaced uninvited. The crack of thunder from a storm at sea, the sudden tilt of the deck beneath her boots, Ramirez's soft voice in twilight. It was not one memory that unsettled her, but the absence of the life that had carried those memories. She carried the uniform in her closet like an anchor, unable to let it go, unwilling to put it on. Her family welcomed her home warmly, but even with their love, there was a distance she could not bridge. At gatherings, her mother would touch her hand with quiet concern, as though searching for the daughter she had once known. Her younger cousins spoke eagerly of school, of dances, of careers unfolding ahead of them. Claire listened, smiling when expected, but part of her remained elsewhere, suspended between the life she had lived and the life she now struggled to claim. The hardest moments came in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded her. She would walk the dim streets of her neighborhood, the cool night air stinging her lungs, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots. Sometimes she paused beneath the old oak tree near the park, running her hand along the rough bark, grounding herself in the present. Other times she closed her eyes and heard the echo of waves colliding against steel hulls, the murmur of voices long gone. One morning, unable to bear the solitude, Claire drove to the coast. The sky was pale with early light, the tide pulling steadily against the shore. She sat in the sand, the grains cold beneath her palms, and watched the horizon as if it might offer her an answer. The water glittered in silence, indifferent to her searching. She whispered her shipmates' names into the breeze, as though the sea might carry them back to her. Her struggle was not only with absence, but with identity. Who was she without the Navy? Without the rhythm of commands and camaraderie? At the workshop, she was simply Claire, the woman with calloused hands and steady patience. Yet inside, she was still Donnie, the sailor who had stood firm in storms, who had leaned against a railing at dusk and felt both infinitesimal and infinite. Reconciling those selves felt like trying to stitch two torn fabrics with thread too fine to hold. The weight of it pressed against her chest, and some days it was all she could do to rise from bed, to lace her boots, to step out into the world that no longer felt like hers. But even in those moments, there was something quiet within her, something that refused to break. She carried that same instinct she had carried through storms. to move forward, even when fear shadowed every step. It was during this time that she began to write. At first, only fragments, words scribbled in the margins of notebooks, lines written on scraps of paper she stuffed into her jacket pocket. "The sea does not vanish when you turn away," she wrote once. "It waits, it remembers." Other times, her words were sharper, aching. "I do not know where I belong. I only know I was once whole." Writing did not solve the ache, but it gave shape to what she carried. Her notebooks became a kind of quiet companion, one that listened without judgment, that held her truth when her voice faltered. And slowly, through ink and silence, she began to see that her struggle was not a sign of weakness, but of humanity. She had given so much of herself to service, and now she was learning to give something back to herself. The patience to heal, the permission to grieve, the courage to rebuild. On evenings when the loneliness pressed hardest, she lit a single candle on her windowsill. Its flame flickered against the glass, a soft glow visible to anyone passing by. To her, it was a signal, not unlike the beacon sailors once lit to guide ships home. It reminded her that though she felt lost, she was not invisible. She still carried a light. And perhaps, she thought, one day that light would guide her toward a new horizon, different from the sea she once knew, but no less vast. Winter arrived quietly that year, laying its hand gently across Claire's town. The branches outside her apartment grew bare, their silhouettes sharp against pale skies, and frost glazed the edges of her window like delicate lace. Each morning, she rose to the muted hush of the season, her breath visible in the chill air as she walked to work. Life remained steady but heavy, as though each day was stitched together with thread too fragile to last. It was during one of these mornings, the ground slick with ice, that Claire noticed a flyer pinned crookedly to a bulletin board outside the coffee shop she sometimes visited. The paper was damp from frost, but the words were still legible. Veterans Community Choir. Voices Together. She stood staring at it, her gloved hand resting on the corner of the page, uncertain why the phrase tightened her chest. Music had once been a backdrop to her life, sailors humming quietly during night shifts, Ramirez whistling old songs as they scrubbed decks. She had never sung for others, never thought of herself as someone who belonged to a choir. Yet the word "together" lingered in her mind long after she walked away. 2 weeks later, on an evening when loneliness pressed particularly hard, she found herself standing outside the small church hall listed on the flyer. Light spilled warmly from its windows, carrying with it the faint murmur of voices. She hesitated, her boots crunching softly on gravel, her breath caught between nerves and longing. Then, with a steadiness that surprised her, she pushed open the door. Inside, the room was simple. Folding chairs arranged in loose rows, a piano in the corner, and a circle of people chatting with easy familiarity. Some wore old service jackets, patches faded, while others were dressed plainly, their faces lined with years and memory. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes greeted Claire at once. "First time?" she asked gently. Claire nodded, her voice caught in her throat. When the rehearsal began, Claire kept her voice low at first, barely above a whisper. The group sang an old folk song, its melody simple, its harmonies swelling gently like tides. Claire felt her chest tighten as sound wrapped around her, voices rising and falling together, weaving into something larger than any one of them. She had expected to feel out of place, but instead, she felt held. As the weeks passed, she returned, drawn by something she couldn't fully name. Her voice grew steadier, and with it, her spirit. Singing did not erase the silence she carried, but it softened its edges. It reminded her of the ship's cadence, the way voices once rose in unison during drills, how even fear felt less daunting when shared. One evening, after rehearsal, she stayed behind as others gathered their coats. She lingered near the piano, fingertips brushing lightly over its worn keys. The choir director, the silver-haired woman named Margaret, joined her. "You've got a strong voice, you know," Margaret said, her tone gentle. Claire shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I'm not a singer. I just needed to be here. Margaret studied her quietly, then nodded. Sometimes being here is the bravest part. The words sank deep into Claire, resting in a place she hadn't realized was empty. For so long, she had thought of bravery only in terms of storms weathered, commands obeyed, dangers faced. But here, in this small hall filled with voices, she began to see bravery in a new light, in showing up, in opening her mouth to sing, in allowing herself to belong again. Spring approached, and with it, the choir prepared for a small community performance. Claire felt her nerves hum sharply in the days leading up to it, but when the evening came, she stood with the others beneath soft stage lights, the faces of townspeople blurred in the dimness. As the first notes rose, her voice trembled, but then steadied as it merged with the chorus. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. In that instant, she was no longer standing alone. She was back on the deck of a ship at twilight, voices carried by wind. She was sitting in the mess hall, hands trembling, but finding calm in the presence of others. She was both Claire and Donnie, both sailor and civilian, both the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. When the final note faded, there was silence, and then applause, warm and genuine. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks, but beneath it, a swell of something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. Later that night, walking home beneath the early stars, she felt lighter. The loneliness was not gone, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing her down. Instead, it was something she carried alongside new threads of connection, fragile but real. She thought of Ramirez's words once more. We're out here in the middle of nowhere, and somehow it feels like the center of everything. Perhaps this was her new center. Not the sea, not the storms, but the voices she now joined, the community that welcomed her without question. She paused at her apartment door, glancing up at the night sky. The constellations shimmered, unbroken, and she whispered softly, as if to them, I'm still here. And in that simple truth, she found the beginning of peace. Summer settled softly over the town, filling its streets with warmth and long, golden evenings. The choir had finished its season of rehearsals and small performances, leaving Claire with more quiet hours than she expected. Yet this quiet was different from the silence that once weighed on her. It no longer felt like a void pressing inward, but like space. Open, gentle, waiting. Claire often spent those evenings on her porch, a mug of tea resting between her palms, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine from her neighbor's yard. The world seemed slower here, touched by a grace she had once thought beyond her reach. Children played down the street, their laughter rising like music, and every so often a neighbor would wave as they passed. She would lift her hand in return, a simple gesture, but one that reminded her she was not invisible. The candle still sat on her windowsill. She lit it less often now, not because the loneliness was gone, but because she no longer needed a beacon to remind herself she was present. She had found new ways to anchor her days: choir rehearsals when they met, walks along the coast, conversations with her mother that grew warmer and more honest. The threads of her life were weaving together again, imperfect but strong. One late afternoon, she walked to the shoreline where the tide was beginning to retreat, leaving behind ridges of wet sand that glistened in the fading light. The air carried the familiar tang of salt, and the cries of gulls echoed overhead. She bent to pick up a smooth stone, rolling it between her fingers before letting it drop back into the water. Watching the ripples expand outward, she felt a quiet recognition. This was her life now, still marked by what had come before, but expanding, touching places beyond her sight. She thought often of those she had served beside, names that lingered like gentle echoes in her memory. Ramirez especially, his soft laughter, his way of finding meaning even in endless horizon. Sometimes she whispered his words aloud when she felt uncertain. Funny, isn't it? We're out here in the middle of nowhere, and somehow it feels like the center of everything. They had been spoken once about the sea, but now she felt them settling into her own life. Here, In this modest town with its jasmine-scented air and choir voices, she had found her center. Her notebooks grew thicker with writing. What began as fragments had deepened into stories, reflections, pieces of herself she laid down in ink. Some nights, she read them back, her own words surprising her with their honesty. She wrote about storms and silence, about camaraderie and grief, about music and light. She wrote not to capture perfection, but to honor truth, the messy, beautiful, resilient truth of living. It was Margaret, the choir director, who first suggested she share her words. "You carry a voice not only in song but on the page," she said gently one evening as they packed away sheet music. Claire shook her head at the thought of anyone else reading her private reflections, but the idea lingered. Weeks later, she agreed to read a passage at a local veterans gathering. Her hands trembled as she stepped to the front, pages rustling faintly, but as she spoke, she felt the room quiet around her. She told them of storms at sea, of the weight of silence, of finding courage in unexpected places. Her voice wavered, but did not falter. When she finished, the room filled with applause, not the thunderous kind of performance, but the steady, heartfelt kind that told her she had been heard. That night, walking home beneath a sky streaked with silver stars, she felt something lift within her. She had carried her stories for so long, unsure if they belonged anywhere beyond her notebooks. Now she knew they did. They belonged with others. Those who had lived their own storms, those who sought light in silence, those who needed to know they were not alone. As summer deepened, Claire found herself smiling more easily. She still moved carefully through her days, still had nights when sleep was elusive, but she no longer felt defined by struggle alone. She was shaped by it, yes, but also by the resilience that followed, the connections she nurtured, the music and words she now offered freely. One evening, as the sun lowered into a horizon painted in hues of amber and rose, she returned to the coast. The waves curled and broke with timeless rhythm, carrying whispers of a past she would always hold. Standing barefoot in the cool sand, she closed her eyes and let the breeze wash across her face. She breathed deeply, steady and unafraid. In that moment, she understood something she had long searched for. Healing was not a finish line but a horizon, ever-shifting, always inviting, never out of reach. And though she could not know where the tide of life would carry her next, she no longer feared its uncertainty. She stood there until the sky darkened and the first stars emerged. Then, with a quiet smile, she whispered into the wind, not as a question but as a truth. "I belong." And the waves, endless and eternal, seemed to answer back. Autumn crept into the town with a gentleness Claire had come to cherish. The days shortened, shadows stretched longer across the sidewalks, and the air grew crisp with the scent of wood smoke. She found herself walking more often through the winding streets, her boots crunching against scattered leaves, her breath visible in the cool dusk. Something about the turning season mirrored the shift she felt inside herself, subtle, steady, a quiet readiness for what might come next. Her notebooks now filled the small shelf near her window, each one worn at the edges, brimming with words that had once been weight she could not carry aloud. They had become more than fragments. They were a map of her journey, each page a reminder that she was still moving forward. When Margaret suggested that she consider turning them into something larger, a collection, perhaps, Claire felt both exposed and curious. To let her words leave the safety of her home seemed daunting, but part of her wondered if, just as singing had once felt impossible, this too might carry her toward connection. One evening, she carried a notebook with her to choir rehearsal. During a break, she read a few lines quietly to the group, her voice trembling but steadying as she went on. The room grew still, the rustle of coats and sheet music fading. When she finished, there was a silence, full, heavy with understanding, and then one of the older veterans leaned forward, his voice rough but kind. "That's exactly what it feels like," he said softly. Claire met his eyes and saw the truth of it. Her words had not just spoken for her, but for others too. The realization stayed with her, carried like a gentle ember through her days. For years she had struggled with belonging, with the question of who she was outside the uniform. But perhaps belonging was not found in returning to who she had been, but in creating something new, threads of music, words, and connection woven into a fabric uniquely hers. Her mother noticed the change as well. One evening, they sat together on the porch, the air cool enough for sweaters, a pot of tea steaming between them. For a long while they said nothing, simply watching the horizon fade into twilight. Then her mother spoke, her voice tender. "You seem lighter these days, Claire. Not without shadows, but lighter." Claire considered the words, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I think I'm learning to carry the shadows differently," she said quietly. "They're still there, but they don't weigh me down the same way." Her mother reached over, pressing her palm gently against Claire's. "That's strength," she whispered. "Not the kind that fights storms, but the kind that grows roots." Claire felt tears prick at the edges of her eyes, but she did not look away. Instead, she let the moment wash over her, grounding her in the love that had always been there, waiting. As autumn deepened, opportunities began to unfold in ways she hadn't expected. The local library invited her to host a small reading, a gathering where veterans and civilians alike could share stories. At first, the thought of standing in front of strangers again felt daunting, but when the evening came, she walked to the podium with a steady breath. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee, the audience seated in gentle anticipation. She read a passage about the sea, about storms and silence, about how belonging could be found even in the most uncertain places. Her voice wavered at times, but when she looked up, she saw faces leaning forward, listening not just with ears but with hearts. When the reading ended, people came to her, some with handshakes, others with quiet words, a few with tears. One young woman, not yet 20, said softly, "I'm not a veteran, but your words made me feel less alone." That night, walking home beneath trees glowing with amber leaves, Claire felt something expand inside her. She had once thought her service had ended when she folded her uniform away. But now she understood. Her service had simply changed. It was no longer about carrying weight in silence, but about sharing truth in a way that might lighten the burdens of others. On the last evening of autumn, before the first frost touched the town, she returned once more to the coast. The horizon stretched vast and endless, the tide pulling steady against the shore. She stood barefoot in the sand, the chills seeping into her skin, and closed her eyes. The sea's voice rose and fell around her, eternal, unyielding. She whispered softly, as though speaking to the waves themselves, "I am still here, and I am still becoming." For the first time, she felt not only at peace but also at home, with the past she carried, the present she inhabited, and the horizon that stretched before her. The wind lifted her hair, the salt air filling her lungs, and she opened her eyes to the vast expanse. There was no fear now, no uncertainty sharp enough to break her. Only the steady truth of her own resilience, and the promise of new horizons yet to come. The first frost came quietly, settling over the town in silver threads that shimmered against the rooftops and grass. Claire woke early that morning, her window rimmed with pale light, the air crisp enough to make her breath curl in small clouds. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and listened. The world was hushed, softened by the season's first true chill, but in that stillness, she felt something stir inside her, a sense that the months ahead would not be about retreating inward, but about reaching outward. Her calendar, once a blank wall of days she dreaded to cross through, now carried notes in her handwriting, rehearsal times, a library reading, a workshop she had agreed to help lead for younger veterans. Each line felt like a thread binding her more firmly to life outside the shadows. It was not that the pain was gone, it never was, but rather that she had begun to discover ways of carrying it that did not isolate her. On the morning of the workshop, Claire stood in the mirror longer than usual, buttoning her shirt, smoothing the collar with steady hands. The reflection that met her was still marked by the years of service and struggle, but her eyes carried something steadier now. Not certainty, never that, but a willingness to be seen. She touched the chain around her neck, a small pendant her mother had given her years ago, and whispered, "Let's do this." The community center smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee when she arrived. A circle of chairs had been set up in the hall, their arrangement simple but intentional. Veterans of different ages and branches trickled in, some walking with quiet confidence, others carrying the stiffness of memories that clung close. Claire felt the old nervousness rise in her chest, but when she sat among them, something shifted. She was not there as a lecturer, nor as someone who had mastered the journey. She was there as one of them, carrying her own fragments into the room. When it was her turn to speak, her voice began softly, almost tentative. She told them not of victories, but of the nights that felt endless, of the silence that weighed heavier than any battlefield. She spoke of writing by the dim light of a lamp, of singing when she thought her voice had been lost forever. As she spoke, she noticed nods, small gestures of recognition, the kind that said, "Yes, I know that weight too." Then, one by one, others began to share. A young man spoke about the fear of going home to a family that could not understand him. An older woman described the ache of losing comrades who had been her closest family. A man with weathered hands admitted he had never spoken his memories aloud until this day. The air grew heavy with truth, but it was not suffocating. Instead, it was full, thick with the strength of voices no longer buried. Claire listened, her heart tightening with each story, yet also softening with the realization that this circle was a bridge, a place where brokenness could be held without judgment. By the time the session ended, the frost outside had melted into sunlight. The veterans lingered, some exchanging numbers, others simply shaking hands with quiet gratitude. As she gathered her notebook, one young woman approached her. She wore a faded jacket and carried an unease in her stance, but her eyes were steady as she said, "I thought I was the only one who couldn't shake it. Hearing you, it makes me think maybe there's a way forward." Claire felt her throat tighten, her chest swell with something fragile but powerful. She reached out, resting her hand gently on the woman's shoulder. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Not anymore." That evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned shades of rose and indigo, Claire returned to the choir. They rehearsed a piece filled with rising, layered harmonies, voices weaving in and out until the sound felt almost like a tide lifting her. As she sang, she closed her eyes and felt the resonance in her chest, the way her own voice joined and lifted with the others. It was not about being perfect. It was about being present, about letting her voice exist among theirs, unhidden. Walking home later, the street lamps flickering on one by one, Claire reflected on the day. For years she had believed healing was something solitary, a quiet battle fought behind closed doors. But now she saw it differently. Healing was not a solitary path. It was a bridge built by voices, her own and those of others, spanning the gulf between silence and connection. She paused at her porch, the cold air brushing against her face, and looked up at the night sky. Stars scattered across the darkness, faint but unwavering. She breathed deeply, letting the coolness fill her lungs, and felt an unexpected peace settle within her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer felt empty. Claire stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapping around her, and carried the quiet conviction with her. She was part of something larger now. A chorus, a circle, a bridge of voices that would not break.